to any ideas from people on the panel, but also from people who are just here or people who hear about this. I am open to people sending in op-eds on specific topics, just wild ideas like, wouldn't it be cool if we could just do this? Anything that would be helpful. And I will be responsible for pulling all of this together and then circulating it. And if we get funding, I might even try to print this in a pamphlet that we can hand out for those of us who still like having things in writing, printed material that we can pass around. Right, so that is my goal from this. And as I say, my goal is to be the one who gives voice to, and 48 Hills' goal is to be the one who gives voice to your ideas and to help reach out to the community and get as many ideas as we can. Okay, with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to the panelists. I'm going to ask the panelists to speak for no more than 10 minutes because I want to have plenty of time for Q&A. We're going to go till 7:30. In terms of Q&A, the easiest thing to do is if you put your questions in the chat, then I can go through them and pull out questions and everyone can see them. If you have trouble doing that, if you go to reactions on your screen, you can raise your hand and I can unmute you and call on you. We have quite a crowd tonight and I'm really glad to see everybody here. So feel free to add ideas. At that point, I'm just going to introduce the panelists and thank you all panelists for taking the time to do this. Claire Lau represents Just Recovery San Francisco, which is the Just Recovery Campaign Committee, which is also affiliated with San Francisco Rising and the Chinese Progressive Association. Anand Singh is the president of the Hotel Workers Union Local 2. Preston Kilgore works in Dean Preston's office, but he's here tonight representing the Public Bank Coalition. Paul Bowden represents the Western Regional Advocacy Project. And Calvin Welch, among many other hats, is a founder of the Council of Community Housing Organizations. So all of you have expertise and familiarity in certain areas, and I will ask you about that. But I also want all of you on the panel to feel free to talk about anything that you think fits in the category of economic justice after COVID. Right? We're going to do future panels on racial justice and climate justice. All of these things merge together. They're not different individual things, but we figured those are three general areas to break things down in as we start talking about a just recovery. Okay, so with that said, I'm going to ask Claire to start us off. Claire, you are working with the Just Recovery Campaign Committee. You also work with SF Rising and CPA, which represents
and Jobs with Justice.
And Jobs with Justice, which represents a lot of working class people of color in San Francisco. And I would love to hear your take on where we go from here. What does a just economic recovery look like to you?
Yeah, thank you so much, Tim, and thank you for putting this together and inviting me. And I think this is a very important conversation for us to have, like right now at this moment. You know, as you've said, the COVID-19 pandemic has kind of turned the world upside down. It's really exposed and exacerbated some of the existing disparities that have actually long existed in our system. So right now is a great opportunity for us to kind of hit the reset button and figure out, you know, how do we address these systemic issues? And we know that the mortality, the poverty that was experienced during the pandemic has been mostly experienced in communities of color, immigrant communities, you know, women, the formerly incarcerated, especially if you look at like workers, the economic impacts, as well as the health impacts. And these were communities that, you know, were never actually able to benefit from the wealth of the Bay Area to begin with. And so the reason why the Chinese Progressive Association, Jobs with Justice, SF Rising have come together is that we cannot return to the status quo right now. And we have to address some of these longstanding inequalities and address this structural racism, structural poverty that basically keep certain communities down. And you know, as you've mentioned, you know, our organizations have been involved in organizing and building power in you know, working class communities for years. And we've been trying to raise the bar for workplace standards, for progressive revenue, for education equity, and so on and so forth. So we felt that right now, during this critical juncture, these communities' voices have really been sidelined. They haven't been in the center of our conversation around recovery. And so some of our, questions that we have are, how are we organizing workers, and how will we sustain an economic recovery unless our workforce is equipped to defend and advance their workers' rights? Like, in other words, workers need to know their rights and be able to organize. And many of our low-wage, immigrant workers currently do not have access to union jobs. How is the recovery and public investments at every single level of government, locally, statewide, federally, actually reaching and benefiting those that are most harmed by both the pandemic itself and by structural racism? There's a lot of talk about businesses, but not nearly as much talk about the workers themselves. And how can these investments lift up working people in the long term and just not be like a one-time, cash? That's good, but it's not enough to address structural problems. Where is the conversation on job quality standards and workers' rights in this recovery? Where is the accountability for massive bailouts on the private sector when it comes to workplace rights and standards? Like, if the government is going to be giving money to businesses, how do we ensure that they are not preventing workers from unionizing? How is workforce development and economic development operating to serve community needs and how do we make sure that those who actually need it are able to access it? Because there are programs out there, but a lot of people are still left out. And finally, how can San Francisco, this progressive, wealthy city, support undocumented immigrants? So what we think an just economic recovery ought to look like, as Tim says, we have, I guess, 5 major buckets of things. Firstly, we have to support pathways to high quality, long-term jobs for communities who suffered most unemployment, both long-term and as a result of the pandemic. So these includes workers of color, immigrants, working class women, the formerly incarcerated. We have jobs programs out there, but a lot of these folks, too many of these folks are still left out of those workforce development programs. So how do we make sure that people who need it the most are actually getting into those programs? And we're particularly interested in jobs that in of themselves help our communities, like childcare jobs, public sector jobs, green jobs. We want to make sure that these are good union jobs, well-paying, long-term, stable. And then secondly, how do we remove the barriers to workforce development programs? For example, CPA has done work supporting pathways to union hospitality jobs for immigrants. But we've faced challenges because people just need to survive, like right now. And so we've had challenges with retention of some of these folks within the workforce program. And this just goes to show, like, if we're going to have workforce programs for low-income workers, we need to have paid trainings. People need to be able to receive a paycheck while they're going through training. We need to have programs that remove language barriers. We need to offer things like childcare and transportation, because those can be things that will stop somebody from being able to complete a workforce program training. Third, we need to monitor the quality of jobs. We talk about, back to work, but we also need to talk about what is the quality of the job. We don't want people to be making, less than minimum wage with, no paid sick leave, right? And we want to make sure that newly placed workers, through workforce development programs, actually have secure long-term careers and not just like 6-month stints and then they're out on their own again, right? So we want to make sure that we can monitor and support workers so that 5 years later they're still employed and they have a career path. Fourth, we want to support undocumented San Franciscans. Right now, undocumented immigrants have no protections whatsoever, in their workplaces. They are left out of most social safety net programs. They are not eligible for workforce development programs, completely left out of the workforce conversation. So how do we support undocumented immigrants when it comes to the workplace? And then lastly, we want to empower workers. We want workers to know their rights and to be able to know how to organize, so that, because it's hard to, like, even if you know your rights, you can't necessarily do anything about it unless have the ability to organize. So we want to make sure that workers are given the processes and the spaces where they can organize. How am I on time now?
We've got about 2 more minutes.
Okay. So, a great example of something that's already out there that, I think is good to look at is the National Domestic Workers Alliance has partnered with SEIU to create a Care is Essential campaign. And they're supporting the massive investments that are coming into care work through the American Jobs Plan from the federal government. And they have, in addition to, just wanting that money, they are adding stipulations for good wages, protections like paid sick leave, processes to unionize and organize workers, and a pathway for citizenship for undocumented domestic workers, which are some of the most vulnerable workers, because your employer is just one person, or it's in somebody's home. So that's a great example of something that's happening. And so we've been talking to lots of organizations, building out coalitions and figuring out what we can do at different levels, locally, regionally, and statewide to address some of these issues, and really to lift up the conversation around a just recovery for workers, because we feel like workers have not really been central to the conversation around a just economic recovery. So I think I'll pause here.
Claire, thank you so much. And that is a great transition to Anand Singh, who is the president of the Hotel Workers Union Local 2. And Anand, your workers have been some of the hardest hit by the pandemic, and some of those who will be most struggling as we come back. Talk to us about not only just hotel workers, but the role of labor unions in economic recovery and in a just recovery.
Absolutely. Thanks, Tim. Yeah, as you said, the impact of COVID on our members was profound. I mean, we had, at the time of the shutdown, 90% of our members were out of work, were laid off. And that number held for, all of 2020. We're back up slightly, probably up to 35% of our members. So it's been a long, hard winter for our members, so to speak, but they've weathered the storm and folks are ready to come back to work. There's some light at the end of the tunnel in terms of vaccination and the industry rebooting, but the industry itself is depressing staffing levels, trying to keep as many workers out of work as possible. Don't believe the hype that you hear out there about service sector workers don't want to come back to work. I'm sure that's true in non-union restaurants and hotels where people are paid substandard wages and have no benefits. Our members who have fought for a union standard, and I think union workers who have fought for and struggled to build a union standard in their contracts, do want to return to work. They want to earn a living for themselves and their families. And I think we just need to push back against that narrative. But specifically, I think, from our perspective, from Local 2's perspective, a just recovery really centers around 3 different areas. So number one, I want to talk about fighting back against the corporate pandemic, what I call pandemic profiteering. The hotel industry immediately following the shutdown, so March, April, May last year, made all kinds of statements. The top CEOs of the biggest hotel owners and operators in this country were speaking publicly about how this is an opportunity to right-size their businesses, and that they could see certain elimination of services continuing long term, that they can make those changes permanent and increase their bottom lines. Coming out of 2020, all of these companies, the major companies, Hilton, Hyatt, Marriott, the biggest hotel owners, Park, Host, are very profitable. They were very profitable during 2020. That's a narrative that's not really out there. I think people just assume that hotels were shut down and are in a poor position. They're actually in a very good cash position, are sitting on huge cash reserves, have throughout 2020 had continued to acquire and build new hotels during the shutdown. Their stock prices have either at this point recovered to pre-pandemic levels or surpassed their pre-pandemic levels. The CEO of Hilton, Chris Nassetta, got raised to $55 million at the end of last year, nearly doubling his compensation. So they talk about how they struggle and they go to Congress and they go to the government with their hands out. But these are immensely profitable corporations who stand to profit a lot more. So now we see them trying to make good on their promise to their shareholders and their investors at the start of the pandemic to seize the opportunity. They're eliminating services, they're slashing, the workforce, and in particular, their plan is to eliminate daily room cleaning. So when you check into a hotel, your room's not clean during your stay, and they dress it up as a COVID safety precaution. Before the pandemic, they dressed it up as an environmental program. So that's the direction this industry is headed. That could mean the permanent loss nationally of over 200,000 jobs. Permanent elimination of jobs that disproportionately impacts women, Black, Indigenous people of color who work in this industry. And I think there's an opportunity right now for us to push back against that narrative, both locally here and nationally. So our union's going to be, running campaigns over the next several months as things are reopening, as staffing levels are, there's a real compression and workload issues in the hotels. We're going to take to the streets. That's what we know. We know how to do. That's what our members do very well, and make our case to the public. So certainly we want folks to join us out in the streets in pushing back against the pandemic profiteering. Number two, another perspective that we have to offer is, we think a just recovery needs to be about holding corporations accountable for existing laws and legislation. There's a lot of chatter out there. I don't know if other folks have heard this, but there's talk out there about how there's so much bureaucracy in the city that processes should be streamlined. We should be able to get permits and that kind of thing right away because everybody's suffering from this pandemic. I mean, from our perspective, those processes exist in order to have accountability, in order to hold corporations accountable, in order to make sure that we don't have scofflaws that simply flaunt, San Francisco's laws and regulations. Ignoring or streamlining the process leads to corporations like Airbnb taking over, our housing stock in the city. So holding corporations accountable to our existing laws and ordinances and regulations, I think is critical. And with our union in particular, we, along with SEIU, USWW, Supervisors Mandelman and Walton moved an ordinance that protected airport workers, that mandated that their employers have to provide a very high level of healthcare for themselves and their families. Our members who work in airline catering, probably the only group of our members that worked during the pandemic. These are food factories that manufacture, food that goes on the airplanes. Very poor conditions in these warehouses, below freezing and that kind of thing. And they don't have healthcare. They can't afford healthcare. And so this legislation would have mandated, it does mandate, that the employer pay that cost. A company called Sky Chefs is refusing to follow the ordinance, is refusing to follow the law. And in fact, they've been as bold as to move their operations, all the food production for the San Francisco airport down to their San Jose kitchen. So they are doing that in order to avoid this ordinance. It means that they pay workers $4 an hour less in San Jose. It means they don't have to pay for healthcare. And frankly, it's a violation of the law. It still violates this ordinance and this law. And so I think we need to call on our leaders to, and we have, and I think I think the supervisors, especially those that move this legislation, do take it seriously. But this city needs to enforce its laws and hold these corporate outlaws accountable. And if that means pulling permits to the airport, then that's what we should do. We should not be afraid to do that and hold corporations accountable. The third thing I want to talk about is healthcare, because it's unimaginable that we could truly have equity and a just recovery unless we really take on the issue of healthcare. This has always been an issue for our union. We've had strikes. I mean, just about every labor dispute we've had for the last decade plus has been about healthcare. And it's kind of remarkable. A San Francisco housekeeper or dishwasher who's been in the industry for the last 20 years would be $180,000 richer today if healthcare costs had simply gone up at the same rate as other basic necessities. So that didn't happen, right? Healthcare costs have skyrocketed in that period of time. That's $180,000 that a housekeeper could have used to secure more housing, pay for their children's tuition, whatever else they would do, put it towards their retirement. But instead, it's gone to enrich parasitic corporations in the healthcare industrial complex. And they're bleeding our city, they're bleeding our state, they're bleeding this country dry with their practices. So the steepest price on this is being paid by people of color who work in our restaurants, clean our hotels. And so when we talk about equity and rebuilding our economy, how we deal with the fact that Black and Latino and Asian people struggle to build the kind of wealth that many white people have in this country, there's no confronting that legacy of racism without transforming healthcare, in our opinion. So if you're not committed to a universal healthcare system, if you're not committed to stop providing care based on how much money a person has, then you're really not committed to an equitable society. And I think that we need to take that message. I mean, it's really not just a San Francisco issue. I mean, obviously it's not just a San Francisco issue, but we have real opportunity in the state. And our leaders that we send to Sacramento need to be the standard bearers on this, that we have an opportunity to truly secure a universal healthcare system and single payer healthcare in this state. That's something that this governor campaigned on and then immediately, tossed aside when he was elected. His French Laundry, the infamous French Laundry dinner, was with hospital industry executives. So I don't believe this governor is looking to move single payer healthcare in this state. But we do have representatives that we elect to Sacramento, and we need to hold them accountable to be the standard bearers on that issue. So that's what I have for now.
Anand, thank you so much for all of those thoughts. Let's go to Paul Bowden, who has spent much of his life fighting for the rights of the unhoused. And maybe you can talk to us a little bit, Paul, about housing justice. I know you want to talk about both the local and the national level, but talk to us about, economic justice. I was talking, Jenny Friedenbach from the coalition couldn't make it tonight, but she did say that, from her perspective, economic justice means housing justice. And you can't really separate the two. So Paul, talk about that and anything else you want to talk about.
Okay, yeah, and I am often these days the fill-in for Jenny, and I love it. Just so people know, I don't know some of the folks. I come at a hospitality house in the early 80s when I was homeless as a kid, and then was at the Homeless Coalition for a long ass time, and still very, very, very much connected with both. But when I was trying to think of this in advance in terms of an economic justice perspective, and it involves housing, but like I feel like there's an opportunity, especially how COVID just exposed how fucked up and inadequate our service systems are. Like, it was so unprepared for how to respond to an emergency, especially in the homeless arena, but sure as hell not exclusive to the homelessness arena. And it's like, you know, since the war on poverty in the 60s, which was created to kill the revolution, it wasn't addressed to eliminate poverty. And we've been implementing system after system after system that was built on an oppressive mindset, that we need to control these things because they are a problem. These things are our community. They're us. They're our brothers and sisters and our cousins and uncles. And yet we look at the welfare reform that happened. We look at Hope 6. We look at RAD. We look at the immigration changes. We look at our healthcare system. And now we look at our voting rights. Like, because we've been struggling to implement systems of oppression that were created by the oppressors, we're constantly on the reactionary mode of trying to make those things adequate. And I do think that there's some really simple, concrete, and when Ned talked about accountability, I mean, how many local hire ordinances have we seen in San Francisco over the years? Every time we get a new fucking liberal trying to run for office, we get a local hire something, or a inclusiveness something, or a training program around sensitivity. Or, you know, I used to do police department training sensitivity programs on homelessness. I'm telling you, forget it. You're going out to the military base, you know, like, it ain't happening. And so to like actually launch a campaign that's like, when we talk about local hire, we also talk about local control over how their lives are, over how our lives are impacted. When we talk about funding homelessness, we're also talking about hiring homeless motherfuckers. Like, it's crazy. Why is Joe Wilson the only person in 38 years that slept on the floor of a shelter that's now the executive director of a homeless program? 38 years? Give me a freaking break. And Joe is one of my best friends. We were homeless together. Like, but he's not an anomaly. He shouldn't be an anomaly. And Hospitality House has a model for bringing from the community and responding to the community. And that's where I came up. And, you know, they never talk about me as a success case of San Francisco's homeless program. Well, I own a fucking house in Bernal Heights. I should be their biggest success case, you know, but somehow it's like, you didn't play the game. You didn't go along to get along. You didn't become one of us, regardless of your skin color, regardless of your economic status, to be considered successful in the poverty systems. You're supposed to become one of us, what we think you should be, because it's our case plan that's dictating your life. And we have people doing community service hours. Well, why not just do it a paycheck, or this block by block business improvement district shit with all these unhoused people in bright shirts, all really visible so you can see them out there. They're getting life skills training. They're not getting healthcare and a paycheck, but they're doing a job, you know, and uniting those confluences of how the systems play out into where we're all talking about, if you're doing a public service, there should be a paycheck, some healthcare, and a living wage attached to it, period, carte blanche. And that public service is not rocket science. It's caring about your community. And if you care about your community together will figure out what you need to do. You don't need a freaking PhD to run a homeless program, or an MSW to help out a community member trying to get Social Security benefits. I've done it. I got a GED. You know, like, this shit is not, but they make it complicated because they don't really want to address the issue. They want to fuck with poor people. They want to fuck with the people that they're claiming they're trying to serve with their OR programs and the other shit that they do, and their intake processes and their coordinated intake. Why would you do a coordinated intake if everybody had access to services? You wouldn't need it. We didn't need it in the early days. And we were sleeping on muni buses and on floors in crash pads. But you sure as hell didn't need and you know, there's a program for mentally ill people that I used to be the supervisor of on 9th Street that I'm no longer qualified to even refer somebody to. Mentally ill people didn't change. Homeless people didn't change. The hotel didn't change. The funding system changed. And what Gavin Newsom and them guys used to always say to me is, well, yeah, maybe you're right, but you don't control the funding. And that's when I learned that San Francisco has an army of lobbyists, paid lobbyists, full time, working for the mayor's office and working for other city departments that never talk to the community about what we want. They're lobbying based on what who their paycheck is coming from and what they want. And I think there's some really like sort of building off of the Sunshine Act or, you know, whatever. Like there's a mandate that could be had that nobody gets a paycheck to lobby on behalf of our community in DC or Sacramento without directly hearing from the community that they're lobbying on behalf of, and break the chain of their lobbying for Feinstein or Lee or Newsom or Brown. God, Feinstein, I'm giving my age away, huh, Tim? But it, you know, it really struck me on doing the without housing work that we've done after we did the community housing partnership, and we were able to prove, no, we can do our own fucking shit. We can run our own housing programs. And they still have the by far lowest eviction rates. So we know that the shit can work. And you know, to really say that if you're getting $1 of money to do a public service, sweeping streets, cleaning streets, whatever, you know, we don't need business improvement districts to take over our neighborhoods and do shit for us. What did we create a government for in the first place? Oh, not we created, but you know what I mean. Why do we have a government in the first place if we're going to take Reagan's neoliberal economic policies and implement them in San Francisco? We have 16 business improvement districts in downtown San Francisco, folks. So every square inch of downtown San Francisco is now controlled with cameras, with private security, run by the business sector. They call them community benefit districts now as they got bigger. They started as business improvement districts. And that's connected. It's all connected. And I think through our hiring, through our expenditures, we can, and through our policies, we can assert local control. And if the federal funding don't match it, the mayor has to be told, then don't fucking apply for it. Because we have our priorities of what we're doing as a community. And I would rather live within the resources we have with the priorities we set than implement programs coming from the federal government that are dehumanizing us, that are changing the intake policies in public housing so undocumented community members can't live there no more. We choose to accept the funding and then do what the master tells us. But we don't have to live that way if all we would do is decommodify the provision of healthcare and public services.
Paul, thank you so much. And you hit it right on time. Thank you so much. I'm going to shift to Preston Kilgore. I know that you've done a bunch of work on Muni, and Calvin's also going to talk a lot about Muni, but I want to also have you talk a little bit about the role a public bank might have in a just recovery.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. And it's great to be in the presence of so many amazing people. So a few things on public banks. So I'm a legislative aide for Supervisor Dean Preston, District 5, and I'm very grateful and honestly just excited to be working on the reinvestment ordinance, as we called it, that we introduced at the full board in late January, and actually just passed in June. And the legislation was effectively to create a working group of members to come together to create a business plan that includes an investment strategy, a strategy of how we use city funds to fund a bank, the long-term principles of the bank and what those investments look like, And honestly, like before I even jump into that, just give some background. The idea of a public bank has been around for quite some time, going back to John Avalos, who did it, or who had created a working group to just explore what it looks like, who then worked with the budget legislative analyst to put out a report to explore how we could create a public bank. And then it kind of got handed off to Sandy Feuer's office, who made a lot of strides kind of battling out with the treasurer's office around how we could fund this thing. And once Sandy Feuer left, ultimately it got handed to us, and we moved forward with their legislation. And it was legislation they were planning to introduce pre-pandemic. And on the eve of the pandemic, ultimately, they decided not to, just because of the timing. And so we decided to advance that legislation forward. And like I said, passed it in February, and honestly, just actually got the working group seated last Tuesday. So in the last 6 months, it's been a quick acceleration that we're extremely excited about. And so honestly, like, so the public bank legislation that we introduced is a part of like a growing movement across the country to create public banks. And for us, we think that the way that we're framing this is it's part of the economic recovery as we get out of this. We need a public bank as we come out of the pandemic, a financial institution that's accountable to the people and not existing for private profit. We have seen the financial markets accelerate their profits significantly during the pandemic. And now more than ever, as we get out of this, we need to learn from that and make sure that we're addressing some of those critical issues. And so a public bank has the potential to play, has the potential to help with affordable housing, has a potential to help with student debt, has the potential to help with starting a small business. And through the pandemic, most importantly, like small business relief. And so what we saw during the pandemic was that it exposed so many major gaps that exist in this system, right, within this bank industry. In San Francisco in particular, like small businesses really struggled to get access to those PPP loans, paycheck protection loans that came out early on and continued through the pandemic. And oftentimes when they were released, they came on a first come, first served basis, leaving so many businesses behind. And often though that program, it went through big banks, banks that didn't have connections with small businesses, a lot of small business owners who weren't necessarily active with their banks, didn't have those relationships to go to them and say, hey, I have all this paperwork. I want to apply for a PPP loan. How do I get my workforce working again? And in some cases, a lot of those small businesses were businesses of color, first-time small business owners who often had workers who were living paycheck to paycheck or whatever it was, and wanted to bring their workers back. Or were small businesses that were trying to get food out to their communities and couldn't pay those workers to come back. And so a public bank has the potential to assist in that. One example we saw was actually North Dakota. North Dakota is the only state public bank. And there was an article in the Washington Post that came out in the middle of the pandemic that small businesses in North Dakota secured more PPP funds relative to the state's workforce than their competitors in any other state. The PPP's first round, and I'm sure everyone remembers reading the reports of how bad the program went. The state of North Dakota and their business lenders honestly put a lot of the rest of the states to shame. North Dakota had a significant advantage, and a lot of it was a state bank that was beholden to the people, right? They worked with the local banks to make sure they distribute those loans and make sure they rolled them out. They coordinated, educated local bankers, even before the PPP loans came out, because they knew that they were coming out. They were in contact with state legislators, federal legislators, knowing those were going to come out, and were already actively reaching out to their local institutions or local businesses and doing webinars to help them navigate that process as funding became available. And so, essentially, like what we saw in the bank in North Dakota was it allowed the public bank in North Dakota allows small business to expand their lending power and guide them through this growing global financial system that is so extremely problematic. And it really saw those gaps, and they became very exposed during the pandemic. And additionally, like even stepping back further, when we looked at like San Francisco's local programs, we were giving out loans and grants through the city dollars. And a lot of those loans and grants that were going through city dollars, they ultimately just went to landlords and banks directly anyways. Whereas if we had a local public bank, the city could have worked with the local public bank to coordinate with community lenders to possibly waive rent, to defer rent, to wipe off certain amounts of rent, conditionally of receiving those grants and loans, and really negotiating on behalf of local lenders, local small businesses, and organizations like that. And because we didn't have that, ultimately what we saw was we gave grants out, millions and millions of dollars of grants, and they made for great press releases, and they made for great news conferences and whatever it was. But ultimately what we saw was we talked to small businesses and they were like, yeah, I just paid my $5,000 that you gave me last week towards my $120,000 in debt. And that money was gone. Whereas again, a public bank could really help with that kind of stuff. And so again, like the way that we're framing this as we kind of move forward is we frame it as an economic recovery tool. We have a lot of vacant businesses. There's a conversation about the vacancy tax, but for us, which is an important piece of the conversation, but another piece is helping businesses reopen. And the way you do that, as people are struggling in the pandemic to fill these storefronts, is giving them access to capital. And a public bank can do that. And we think that's an important piece of the larger puzzle. And then additionally, a public bank can help with helping finance affordable housing. Oftentimes, when you look at all these pieces that come to the board, it's oftentimes one of the reasons why, among many reasons that I'm sure a lot of people know on this call, is it comes down to finances. The city doesn't have the finances at all the time to finance a full 100% affordable housing project. A public bank will have the ability to assist with that and help finance on these important projects. So we're excited for that. The working group, we're hoping to get seated. They're officially nominated, appointed. We're hoping to get them seated through LAFCO in the next month. We're working with the clerk's office to hire a public bank consultant that will come in and through Supervisor Haney's office, we were able to get about $250,000 to hire that consultant to come in. And as you can imagine, there's not many of these things. North Dakota being the only one statewide, and no local ones, to my understanding. And so like finding the unique skill set to have someone come in and really facilitate this and understand the local economy is an important piece. So we're hoping to bring that consultant on and honestly get this thing going up the next year and ultimately financing it and exploring finances, whether it's with the city's investment pool, whether it's going to the ballot and finding funds to put in there. But yeah, super excited for that. And I think it's going to be a huge piece of this larger economic recovery model as we kind of transition out of this pandemic. And honestly, we're not even out of the pandemic yet. We're seeing the Delta variant kind of rage on. So as we get out of that, it's an important piece. And as I want to transition to something else as well.
You've got about 1 minute.
Perfect. I mentioned ballot measure to finance a public bank. One thing we learned is that taxing, I think everyone on this call knew, or a lot of people on this call knew, taxing the wealthy does very well. And we saw that with Prop I, we saw it with Prop C, we saw it with the wealth tax. And so another strategy as we get out of this is continuing to like partner with electeds, community organizations, with people like you, our advocates on the ground, to like do these ballot measures that tax wealthy people. Prop I, the transfer tax that our office authored and really fought for, it passed with 57.5% of the vote. And a lot of people were against it. Tim actually reported on, I think it was a leaked email at the time that was like wealthy people being like, we have to kill this because it might catch fire across the country. And so as we think through a public bank, as we think through things like Prop I, like we have to think big and tax the wealthy. And that's a big part of our strategy as well, going forward with this stuff.
Thank you, Preston. Calvin, you get to bring us home. Calvin Welch, I know you want to talk about affordable housing and muni, and you have some slides, which I have here. So direct me on and tell me when you want me to show what slides.
I will at the proper time, Tim. Thank you very much. Once again, I think 48 Hills shows that it is the absolutely irreplaceable entity and the polity of this city by putting this together, and how proud I am to be with this panel. I think I've worked, with the possible exception of Preston, with each one of you on political campaigns in the city, and I may have worked with Preston on Dean's campaign. and I want to come back to that point and the point that Preston just made about how delighted San Franciscans are in voting to tax the rich, and how critically important that is to get out of this thing in any kind of shape. But it's important to understand the old German green saying of think globally and act locally. San Francisco has a tendency of believing that it's the center of the earth and that we are the most politically advanced folks in the world, which we're not by a long shot. Although we're reasonably good at what we do, we don't do enough. It is important to understand that we're in the fourth wave of this pandemic. That should all remind us how global it is. The Congressional Research Service this month pointed out that 95 million people worldwide have been pushed into poverty by COVID. Indeed, the Delta variant that we're dealing with comes from India. It may come from somewhere else, but the point is that it is a worldwide system that will keep banging around the world until we get this right, not only here, but in the world. So I think it's important for us to understand the pressures that creates in a city that is open to world financial moves. And nowhere is that, I think, more apparent than in real estate and housing. It's becoming increasingly important in urban transit as well. It's important for us to understand that relationship between the flow of worldwide capital markets and costs of housing in San Francisco. And increasingly, I believe it's going to be the cost of transportation in San Francisco. And elsewhere. It isn't as if we need to build back what we had before COVID, because what we had before COVID was pretty poor. Nationally, the middle class, the working class, saw its income drop by 19% between 1970 and 2018. In 2018, 0.1% of the population owned as much wealth as 90% of the rest of us. 0.1%, not 1%, 0.1%. Between 2000 and 2018, the average salary increased by 17% over those 18 years, less than the rate of inflation. So in real terms, most people dependent upon a wage actually were worse off before COVID than before the Great Recession. But housing especially, and Tim, you might put up the first of the slides, the drop in affordable housing production during the recovery.
Try to do that right now.
From the Great Recession.
Yep. There you are.
The percent of all housing built in San Francisco at 120% or below median declined from 35% of the total housing built in 2012 to 15% in 2016. And during the Lee administration, the amount of deeply affordable housing, that is housing able to be afforded by 50%, people earning 50% of the median income or below, went from 60% of all affordable housing built from 2001 to 2011 to 46% of all affordable housing built from 2012 to 2016. That is a steep decline and a total redefinition of what affordability meant in San Francisco. The challenge that we face coming out of COVID is made even more profound by the incredible threat of eviction that faces thousands of households in San Francisco, thousands of the most vulnerable, economically vulnerable households. And that is a reality that we don't control. Eviction is a function of state law and is a function of federal law. The Supreme Court has already opined that the federal government cannot do a rent forgiveness for much longer. They're looking at local laws and state laws to overturn, and we have to understand that reality, that landlord-tenant law is the very essence of capitalism in a capitalist society, and we have to do workarounds. And one of the workarounds that we have been able to do is create community-based capacity to actually produce, acquire, and manage affordable housing. As Paul pointed out, homeless people, formerly homeless people, became not only residents of residential hotels, but workers in residential hotels, developed by the Coalition on Homelessness and the Council of Community Housing Organizations working together as the Community Housing Partnership, a community-based nonprofit development corporation. Indeed, community-based corporations in San Francisco have generated about 50,000 units that are totally off the private housing market. Indeed, through rent control of residential hotels, affordable housing development, 65% of San Francisco's housing is price controlled, which is the only reason that we have any working class people left in San Francisco. So it is absolutely essential that San Franciscans continue to press the public sector to provide the wherewithal to deal with the depredations created by the market, which is why the current policy and ideology of urban professors in urban studies, with the exception of Tim Redmond, virtually the sole exception of Tim Redmond, is to demand more production of market rate housing on the long scientifically proved fact that if you build more housing for millionaires, homeless people will get housed. That's the magic of the marketplace that never happens. So we're being told at the level of Sacramento that we should not be in charge of producing housing at the San Francisco level, at the local government level. That the state government should preempt, because the state government is so effective at providing, for example, public utilities, and did such a great job in the deregulation of the electrical market. That was a state law. They want to deregulate the housing market and hand it totally and completely over to developers, and grant density bonuses and cut the red tape, as Anand pointed out, for local approvals, and create more market rate housing, which will, the argument goes, address the needs of low income and homeless people, which is—
I'm going to interrupt you to say you've got about 4 minutes left.
Absurd. we're now seeing the same thinking transfer, if you could put up the second one, Kim, on Muni, transferred to public transportation. Basically, the notion is that the only need that the city should fund for public transportation is to get people to and from work. That people do not need public transportation to go to school, to take their kids to the hospital, to take themselves to the hospital, to recreate, to go to Golden Gate Park, to do anything but go to work. And therefore, the Muni system that we had before COVID is simply inefficient because it does not efficiently move people to places of work. Now there's a certain problem. The officials of Muni and the Breed administration say, because we don't really know when the office sector is going to go into full employment. And after all, that's what the Muni system is designed to do, is deliver people to downtown. So that we have this odd situation of the amount of transit service that we have is 24th of 25th in similarly sized agencies across the United States. Muni is delivering 68% of the service hours that it delivered pre-COVID, which is 24th of 25 major agencies. In trips taken, we're at 36% of the pre-COVID levels. Because once again, the only Muni service that Muni felt necessary to provide is to get people to work. And it's obvious that that's critical, but that there is 60% of the trips generated before COVID were not work-related, but were about life and living. 70% of the riders not served by Muni during COVID earn less than $75,000 a year. If you're low income, by definition, you're not working. And given the current leadership of Muni, that means we don't have to provide transit for you. It's the same argument that has been given about trickle-down of housing as well. Finally,
you've got about a minute left.
The last one. We have learned some lessons, I think, as a polity, and that is to use our collective ability, just as Preston and Anand and Claire have said, to push meaningful public policy at the local level. Tim, if you could put up recent affordable housing.
I'm doing it right now.
Between 2018 and 2020, in those 3 election cycles, we passed by convincing margins. The city funded right for legal representation in eviction proceedings, which is going to be absolutely critical in the coming months. We passed a $300 million a year gross receipts tax in Proposition C in 2018, the majority of which goes for affordable housing to extremely low-income people and housing services to existing homeless people. We passed a $600 million local bond for affordable housing. We allow 100% affordable housing projects and educator housing projects in publicly zoned districts and expedite approval of these projects. We limit and meter future office development to the production not of market rate housing, but only of affordable housing. That if we do not produce the RENA required numbers of affordable housing units in a given year, we don't approve office projects. That was passed. We limit Proposition A in 2020 is $207 million for mental health and homeless projects. Proposition I, we already heard about, increased and created an additional $200 million a year for a transfer tax on extremely wealthy real estate transactions. And Proposition K authorizes the city to produce 100,000 units of low-income housing. We know how to do this. And this is what we must continue to do. Can we do?
I'm going to cut you off there only because I want to have time for the, I want to have time for questions. All right, I'm going to open this up to the audience. We have a lot of people here. Thank you all, to all the panelists for phenomenal presentations. And also thank you for sticking around for another half hour so that we can hear from people in the audience. I would encourage you to first put your questions in the chat. If you have trouble doing that for some reason, I will, all right, I have, somebody wants to be unmuted. I'm going to unmute.
Should I just go ahead and ask my
ahead.
question? Great. Well, hi, folks. My name is Laksh. I wanted to discuss another big picture idea with some folks here. I was a co-author of last year's Prop K, which Calvin just talked about, authorize a pilot program for municipal social housing. And what social housing is supposed to mean is a decommodified framework for housing for a broad range of incomes, focus on the working class. And it includes things like co-ops, community land trusts, municipal housing, and nonprofit housing. Many of you know, though, that the social housing part of Prop I didn't make it into the mayor's budget, and that was part of why Dean Preston voted it down. And ultimately, we kind of have to contend with the fact that the biggest obstacle progressives will face with the budget is the strong mayor system of San Francisco. Strong mayor in cities like LA and SF is, I think, a major source of corruption and cronyism, but it also overrides the will of the more representative legislative body. And Prop K passed with 73.5% of the vote, and the mayor can just, as one person, basically decide to block a very popular idea. And so I wanted to kind of raise the point about, this has been done before, but reform of individual departments or even bigger overhaul to create a more kind of leftist participatory democracy. What this could look like for municipal housing, for example, is having a department centered on tenants, elected by tenants as the majority decision makers, because they're the ones who ultimately live in those conditions and should have the biggest say in what goes on. And I feel like this is in line with what Tim mentioned at the beginning, because what we see from moderates in San Francisco is the opposite. There's a push to consolidate more power in the hands of the mayor. I saw the proposal being pushed around to have the mayor appoint the whole school board. And we're often reacting to those kinds of proposals instead of trying to push for what kind of democratic governance in San Francisco could look like. So I just wanted to raise that idea as a thought.
It's a very good idea. And in fact, I have heard former supervisor and assembly member Tom Amiano, I don't think will mind my sharing this with you. He has been talking a lot about charter reform, about finding ways to change the city charter to weaken some of the power of the strong mayor and to give more power and authority to more decentralized ways in San Francisco. Does anyone on the panel want to respond to that or talk about that?
Sure. We had a charter reform commission that was what now? 15 years ago, Tim?
Yeah.
And a new charter that was a quote unquote strong mayor in form. And within 3 years, there were 4 charter amendments that passed that weakened the mayor. It turns out that the best political campaign for against a strong mayor is a strong mayor. People don't like it. We changed the police commission. We took that away from the mayor. We changed the planning commission. We took that away from the mayor, from the mayor having total control. So I think, yeah, charter reform is always good because in point of fact, there are 21 elected officials in San Francisco, and we have a government of 15,000. It is the bureaucracy that runs the city. It is not the elected officials. It isn't simply a strong mayor. It's a strong mayor in league with the departments. Mayors will tell you in honesty that they appoint commissions that they think are theirs. Within 2 years or so, the commission becomes the departments. And it's the departments that run the city. Remember, it's the departments that do the initial budget. they submit the budget to the mayor, and the mayor negotiates with the department and then submits it to the board. The board is specifically by charter restricted from dealing directly with departments about their budget. I mean, it's an absurd situation, but it isn't just a strong mayor. It is a bureaucracy that is the true power of San Francisco's government.
Paul, you have your hand up.
Well, and because that was my point about the departments run what happens in the city. The departments also incredibly, and we saw it with the mental health changes and the treatment changes, they respond to the state and federal funding priorities. RAD, Hope 6, all that shit. And that's where, like, I feel like if we're talking about what do we want, there's an aspect of it is, how do we break that cycle? How do we as a community not allow our city departments to drive shit in a way that is really totally 100% responding to the wishes of the funder, as opposed to the desires and the input of the community? Because we didn't have to do RAD. We didn't have to. It may have been hurtful if we didn't, but maybe then we would have figured out other ways to respond to it. But there are things that we're implementing that we're saying we have to do it in order to get this money. And so long as that's how you're governing your community, you're always going to be relying on who's giving you the money to do your shit. And you're going to end up doing what they do. We've all seen it in the small level with nonprofits and stuff that lose their mission and what they were created to do because they needed the money that the foundations or the city was giving them. And it's a deadly game when it comes to how it impacts poor people.
It's a really important point, Paul. And in fact, this is, of course, in my mind, the problem with seeking philanthropic solutions to problems. Because when you seek philanthropic solutions, you're letting whoever it is, Mark Zuckerberg, Bill Gates, decide what the priorities are in society, right? The funders so often get to decide what the priorities are. I just, as a quick aside on this, I saw this myself when I was applying for money from the Knight Foundation for 48 Hills. The Knight Foundation funds, quote, innovations in journalism. And I said, that's what we're doing here, an innovation in journalism, nonprofit local news site. And they said, well, that's not really what we're talking about here. Maybe if you could develop an app. Like, I don't want to develop an app. I want to expose corruption at City Hall. But no, they don't want to fund that. They want to fund an app. All right. So yes, this is a big challenge for all of us. Other questions? Who else in the audience has questions? Raise your hand or put something in the chat. I see.
Scott has their hand raised.
Yep, I see. Hold on. I'm unmuting. I think that's Bernie Choden.
It is.
Yes, it is. Hi, Bernie.
Hi. And Calvin, you and I share, and I totally agree with your adult view of these things. We don't always agree, but we do on what you said. Very clear, very adult. We too are the only ones in this panel who've ever built affordable housing. The expertise lacks. We have critics. We don't have doers. One way to which I will add, Calvin, is to restore the general plan code, which has been emasculated at the state level so that we have a force of law. I do have access to a wide array of legal help, as you do, and we know the same people. You have to, in effect, enforce the law, in effect, and that's the means to do it in Sacramento. Secondly, there are 80% of our city, that's almost 600,000 people, who cannot afford market rate housing. Looking at Singular means experiments to deal with the diverse needs is not the way to go. We have diverse means of providing that housing. Right now, for example, the state legislature has emasculated the David Sterling cooperative law. They've made it impossible for co-ops to exist. We've done nothing here politically, and all of you here have been part of this. In effect, not dealing in effect with the realities of enforcing the law. Okay, I'm here, Calvin's there, and we know how to do it.
Thank you,
I've
Bernie.
administrated some very, very large entities. I've also built one of the very largest cooperative establishments, Lafayette Park in Detroit. I had Mies van der Rohe for my architect. So that's experience. I've also worked for the London County Council, who developed social housing. I did the work, I was there. I don't just talk about it in small parts. Social housing is a nice thing, but it is only one of the very small means. You can't do it if you put your brains in your feet.
Thank you, Bernie. Anyone on the panel want to respond or comment on Bernie's point? Lask, you're still here. Do you want to talk about social housing? I got to unmute you.
Oh, no, I don't have anything further to say.
Okay, any other questions from the audience? We've got about 10 minutes left. Let me go back, since we've got about 10 minutes. And we have, if there's any other questions from the audience, please add them in, type them into the chat, or put your hand up and I'll be happy to recognize you. I want to go back, since we have several people here who have talked about this, and I'm interested in any of the panelists' thoughts on this. Muni, as it was created, I think Calvin talked about this, Muni as it was created is not going to serve, I think, is not going to serve the San Francisco of the future, because I actually think, and I'm interested in anyone's response on this, I actually think that we may end up with, I don't know, 10 million square feet of empty downtown office space 5 years from now. We might end up with, as I say, people just not working in downtown offices. I think they're still going to, I think hotels are going to come back, and hospitality is going to come back. People are still going to come to San Francisco, but I don't see all of those office workers going back to the office in the same way as they did before. So what do we do with, number one, what do we do with 10, 20 million square feet of empty office space? I have talked to numerous people about this and said, hey, why don't we just take that all that office space, rent it at pennies on the dollar, because the landlords aren't going to get anything more, and make it into space for performing and studio artists, right? Claire, maybe you can talk about that a little bit. I mean, we haven't talked much about the arts. Correct me if I'm wrong, but what artists need most in San Francisco is affordable space, right? Performing artists need affordable space. Visual artists need affordable space. Muni aside, how we're getting people there and back, what do we do with 10 million square feet of empty office space in San Francisco? Anyone have any thoughts?
I'll just say, speaking as an individual and also an artist, absolutely, I think the lack of affordable space is the biggest challenge that artists face, and San Francisco has had, a big exodus of artists because of that, because of how expensive it is. And I love the idea. I don't know exactly how we could make that happen, but I love the idea of converting office spaces to artist studios.
And, and this is, I mean, maybe that's a crazy idea that wouldn't work, but one of the things I want to do with this whole process is come up with some ideas like this that may sound completely wacky, but when you actually think about it, hey, if we want to repopulate downtown and there's not enough office workers, artists also go to cafes.
Right.
And artists also shop at small businesses. And that might be a way to repopulate downtown. And by the way, I will just say, I said this at the beginning, but I'll say it again, Claire's art is really, really beautiful. And if you're interested in it, she has put her website in the chat, and we'll be participating in Open Studios. And that is my personal pitch for Claire's art, because I think it's really, really great. Not just because she agreed to be in this panel, but that too. Anyone else on the panel have any thoughts about this?
Yeah,
Go ahead,
I mean,
Paul.
I think also in addition to, in addition to looking at how do we convert empty space to artist space, I'm in the Redstone building, the Redstone Labor Temple on 16th Street, and Lakeside Investment Company is taking our shit over. And there's going to be a whole bunch of artists, a whole LL, a transgender homeless program. Like there's going to be a whole bunch of really struggling poor artists and community groups and the lab and others. We are going to be ass out. I mean, based on everything this investment company has ever done, what they did in Oakland to the Filipino community people that when they took over one of their buildings. And so when we go to the city, it's, oh, well, we can't put any money up. We can feel bad for you. We can pass a resolution, but they're not actually playing the capitalist game of preserving the spaces that are being lost. And then they're talking about, there was a project on Mission Street. It's $3,000 a month. I met with Clarion Alley Mural Project and the lab and the Poster Syndicate and us together trying to figure out how we could make that space work. And it's tiny and it's $3,000 a month. And it's a condo, corporate, fucking disgusting building energy to be in. And so they're not stopping it on the front end. It's a lot like homelessness, you know, not stopping it on the front end and then trying to be all liberal and shit about how they're going to address it at the back end. And I think there needs to be more of a warrior attitude in saying enough is enough. If back in the day, the live work lofts was supposed to address this. That didn't work out too freaking well, except for the condo developers. And so I think we need to get more of a joint partnership to actually fight shit with our local government than to get them to feel sorry for us and pass meaningless resolutions.
You know, you raise it up again. I mean, all of you have raised a lot of important points. And one of the important points that I think you're raising there is, yeah, I mean, the Redstone building, which is also known as the Redstone Labor Temple, is an incredibly important part of San Francisco's culture right now because of who gets to have inexpensive office space there. It's crazy that the city wouldn't buy that. You know, I think back when I lived on Fillmore and Hayes in 1985, my 7-unit building went on the market for $280,000. Right? That's $40,000 a unit.
Well, that's the difference, Tim. We have created city funds and mechanisms to purchase building for housing.
Yeah.
We have not created that to purchase buildings for work or art.
Right.
And it's an important, the arts were always downtown. Artists were always in the South of Market. They're not there anymore because they have been priced out.
Right.
So it's a great idea, but I think we do need to learn from the live work loft struggle and the errors made by artist advocates, refusing affordability requirements. When many of us argued you're going to be taken over by market rate housers and you're going to end up condominiums. Unless you specify. But you know, once again, we have no program to acquire real property for anything but a housing use, and it took a long time to get it for a housing use. I mean, co-ops, social housing are now able to be acquired, but it took ballot measures, it took advocacy, it took organizing. Well, the same's going to have to happen. And that was the point of me trying to point out. I think we know how to do that. And I think we can do that, and we ought to. We ought to do. They're not going to take our vote away in San Francisco. They're not going to take our vote away in California. At the local ballot, we'll have, maybe even at the statewide ballot, although we're not that well organized yet. Only labor is organized at the statewide level. And sometimes I'm stunned at what they go for at the statewide level. But nonetheless, amongst our allies, only labor is organized at electorally, politically at the regional level. We have to share that. They have to share that ability with us, because the struggle is going to be over land use and over use of increasingly valuable property when a third of San Francisco in 50 years is underwater. And maybe 5 or 10 million of that gross square feet of office building is going to be great for water polo and not.
Yes, Calvin, I appreciate that. And the point I was making was not that we can't do this, but that imagine if we had bought every building that came on the market in 1984.
At today's bargain price.
Yeah, right. And it's just astonishing how much at any rate, we are almost out of time. I want to take a moment again and thank all of the panelists for coming and giving us an hour and a half of your time tonight. I know all of you are really, really busy. And I think this was a really productive discussion and a start. And again, I want to encourage everyone who is on the panel and everyone who's in the audience and everyone who sees this later and talks to their friends to let us know what ideas you have that we might want to include in this agenda and platform. I'm open to everything. I put my email, it's easy to remember, just tim@48hills.org will work just fine. Feel free to send me anything. And again, thank you all so much. This was a really interesting hour and a half.
Thank you, Tim.
All right. So we
you.
will be in touch. I will be putting out information on our next forum as soon as I get a date certain and get it organized. All right. So I will just say good night, everybody, and thanks for being here.
Good night.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Many of you.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, panelists.
Thank you, Tim.
Thanks, Tim.